harder, just hoping that he eventually passes, and it takes a significant amount of time. It takes several minutes, as you'll hear her say. After that, after Shad's deceased, she describes what she then does with his body, again, engaging in sexual acts, ultimately dismembering him quite significantly. She reports that afterwards, that law enforcement would have fun finding all the body parts that are located throughout the basement, told law enforcement where to find certain body parts. Like I said, it wasn't obvious to law enforcement who initially respond to that basement what happened. It's information being provided by the defendant that later is corroborated by law enforcement. You'll hear the defendant admit to cleaning up, avoiding guilt, avoiding responsibility for this. You'll hear her talk about that. You'll see the signs of that, as I mentioned earlier. That dismemberment process takes that entire day of the 22nd, essentially. As I mentioned, Tara wakes up to Taylor leaving at about 2:33 a.m. on the 23rd. The investigation doesn't stop there, despite the defendant's confessions. Law enforcement continues. They send DNA to the lab, and it confirms the accounts that we're getting here. Blood on the defendant's hands, left and right hands, or Shad's. Blood on the knives, some of the knives that are used is Shad's. The clothing item, as I mentioned, the black sweatshirt, black sweatpants, has red substances, blood on the sweatpants, all consistent with what happened, with the defendant's statements, with what law enforcement's seeing. So this case is really not a whodunit. You'll hear about the crimes that clearly occurred. You'll hear the defendant's statement saying, yep, I did it. And you have DNA evidence and other investigative tools that kind of corroborate everything else. So for this, the defendant's charged with the three crimes that the judge read off earlier. First-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, or dismembering a corpse, and then third-degree sexual assault. So we'll get into what that all means later. We'll have closing arguments where we kind of provide summation and provide all that to you. But for now, as you kind of listen to the evidence, count one, the state needs to prove that the defendant caused the death of Shad and that she did so intentionally. As I mentioned, you're going to hear a lot about that. And it's nothing but intentional. This is not an accident. This is not a mistake. It's a significant act the defendant did. Dismembering a corpse for the purpose of concealing a crime, you'll hear a lot about that. And third-degree sexual assault, how she engaged in oral contact with Shad's body and inserted objects in his body as well after the fact. I know in voir dire some of you talked about, you've heard some about this case, and that's to be expected potentially. It's really important to stress that our system of justice is not based on media accounts, on word of mouth, on what you hear. The evidence is what happens in these four walls, and what you hear and see. And ultimately, the evidence in this case will point to one area. The defendant is guilty of these three crimes. So again, this is just meant to be an overview on the evidence we expect you to hear over the next few days in the first phase. But ultimately, the case comes down to choices and responsibility. The defendant made a series of choices, February 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. Choices to use methamphetamine, choices to kill her friend, Shad, choices to then utterly degrade him after the fact. The choices the defendant made. And when we come back in closing arguments later this week at some point, we'll argue to you that the evidence in this case is clear. The choices the defendant made indicate that you're not going to have a reasonable doubt about what the defendant did.